Welcome to Transcendent Psychotherapist. In this episode, I'm going to be introducing you to a new thinker in idealism called Mary Whiton Calkins. I say new. She actually lived Florowit 1863 to 1930. I'm going to be comparing her a little bit, for those of you who are fans of Bernardo Kastrup, with his thinking. So she was an interesting character. I think her work is less known, partly because she was a woman and struggled getting her thinking taken quite so seriously, although she was the first female president of the American Psychological Association and the first president of the American Philosophical Association after the two organizations separated. So what does she think? She's an idealist. She's an absolute idealist. We'll talk about absolute idealism in a second, but she's also a personal absolute idealist. We'll explain that in a moment. So absolute idealism was the thinking that of people like Fichte, Schopenhauer, Hegel, and so on, that all of reality is essentially mental, and that all of reality is essentially one. It's a kind of monist belief, really. Bernardo Kastrup, if we compare her with Bernardo Kastrup and also compare her with Fichte and Schopenhauer, actually, what's the difference between personal idealism or personal absolute idealism and their thinking? So Kastrup and Fichte and Schopenhauer basically thought of the absolute, and Kastrup would call it mind at large, or the kind of field of consciousness, as impersonal, whereas Calkins sees it as personal. I'll let you explore a bit more around what she means by personal, but she kind of sees the personal meaning like the absolute can change. The absolute is within an environment, for example. I think there's a problem with that thinking. If it's the all that there is, how can it be in an environment? But I think her thought, with some qualification, still remains interesting. We might want to think through what that means, though. What does it mean to be personal? At some level, I guess it means maybe metaconscious, what Bernardo Kastrup would call metaconscious, able to think, able to kind of be much more self-aware, able to perhaps even kind of have a teleological and kind of planning type approach to reality. It's what it's trying to do. So perhaps the best thing for us to do would be to just introduce her thinking on idealism first of all, and then think about how she differs from the others and why. So she kind of argues for idealism along the lines of thinking, well, we are related to the world and to other people. We know, there's an assumption here, so working within an idealist framework, we know that we're mental. I guess materialists would probably agree with that as well. We know that we're subjective, experiencing entities. But she says, for us to be able to relate to the world must really entail that the world is fundamentally mental as well. Because, she argues, for things to be in relation, there must be a kind of internality to them. There must be a common set of qualitative properties that allow them to connect and to relate. And so, therefore, if we know we're mental, then everything else that we know must also be fundamentally mental. And then she argues, well, we know we're also limited, and yet we're not all that there is. There is a wider kind of world and other things, other persons, and so on. So therefore, we mustn't fall into solipsism. If we're not to fall into solipsism, but still maintain that we can relate to other things as real, then those other things must be mental as well. There's a wider mental landscape, if you like, in which we sit. Now, Bernardo Kastrup, Fichte, Schopenhauer, Hegel, and so on would agree with all of that. So let's explore in a moment how she gets to personal idealism. I just want to say first, before we do that, one of the criticisms of that argument I just gave might be that, well, surely if things have to have something in common for us to be able to relate to them and to be able to know them, surely that could be an argument used within materialism, that the world is fundamentally material, we are fundamentally material, and therefore we're able to kind of, there can be traffic and connection between the two. Yes, but we get into a whole rabbit hole of the philosophy of mind here, which I don't intend to get into. Perhaps we can just at the very least point out that if we are mental and we're relating to a material world, if there's common properties between the two, then we've at the very least got to say that the material that we're seeing has mental properties to it, in which case we're shifting the goalposts somewhat on what we're saying materialism is, and we're getting into maybe some dual aspect materialism of some sort. Okay, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but basically she makes an argument to say, look, we're mental, we connect to the world, we can only know the world because it's also fundamentally mental as well. So that is kind of roughly kind of idealism. How does she get to personal idealism? So let's kind of work at that through comparing with the other absolute idealist. So Schopenhauer basically sees the absolute as less than personal. And Calkins looks at that, his thinking, and says, well, look, you've already accepted that the absolute is a kind of willing. It's a kind of an act of willing and desiring. And she argues, well, why stop there? If you've already accepted that the absolute is a kind of subjective I that is willing, why stop with simply that? Surely it could have personal attributes like we do. And she's going to give more arguments on that I'll explain in a moment. We compare her thinking to Fichte. Fichte kind of sees the absolute as more than personal and says, well, the absolute's infinite. How can it be personal? Personal is the sort of thing that you get of limited beings like us. And Calkins sort of says, well, why not? Why assume that the infinite can't be personal? Why assume that that personhood must be limited? Okay, now I think an interesting argument she gives, that I alluded to a moment ago, is that basically she says there's another reason why we should accept the absolute as personal. Now, like Schopenhauer, like Fichte, like Bernardo Kastrup, she would see us as entities within the absolute. Okay, but she would say, look, the only reason we can relate to other things that are mental and other persons is because the field in which we sit is also personal. The phrase that she would use is to say, in order for us to have relationship, in order for there to be relations between these things, there has to be a relator. And so therefore she would say, well, that is a kind of person like us. We are persons within broader person. Make of that what you will. I think it's certainly an argument that merits some attention. I'm not sure it's foolproof, but it's certainly worthy of some attention. Kastrup and so on would push back and say, look, where's the evidence that the broader conscious field, which he sees as nature or mind at large, what looks like the cosmos to us through our perceptual screen, what's the evidence that the broader reality within which we sit has kind of intentions, that it's kind of that it has a plan, if you like, that it's metacognitive, or that it's personal in that sense that perhaps Calkins sees it. It's interesting. I mean, she's, if you're going along the idea that it's a subject and that it's an I, Calkins is saying, well, why might it not be an I like us? Bernardo Kastrup's like, well, it could be an I in a sense, but doesn't necessarily mean it's an I in a kind of metacognitive sense. Yeah, that's the question that needs thinking through. And she sort of pushes back to people like Fichte and says, well, if you've already gone as far as saying it's a subject, an I that has will and desire, then isn't that pretty close to being personal, being a person of some sort? And she also expands this thinking in thinking around value, because she sort of says, well, the absolute, if you take Fichte's line, or Schopenhauer's line, that and saying it's a willing entity, then willing entails valuing, entails having value. It's willing something, and therefore she argues that it is conceivable that the absolute is good, that the absolute has values that it's working towards. Now, they might not be exactly the same as your and I's values, but if it's all that there is, I guess you might argue, I'm not quoting her now, but if it's all that there is and it's got values, then it's by definition the grounds of all valuing that takes place within the absolute. It's the valuing of what is. And she might argue that is therefore the good. It's what reality's up to. It's what it wants. It's what it's valuing. It's what it's doing. Now, she also, interestingly, kind of denies that the absolute or the personal absolute is the same as God. And her reasons for that, I think, are quite shaky. She says, like, the existence of the absolute is known, and it's known through theoretical reasoning, and so shouldn't be the object of religious emotion or desire, and also that a religious worshipper might think of God as distinct from everything else, but we can't think of the absolute as being distinct from everything else. But of course, this begs a number of questions. I mean, the first reason there that it's theoretically known and needn't be the object of religious emotion or desire, well, that just assumes that, a theistic or a god must be connected to a kind of religious approach, but you could still have a theism without it being connected to a particular religious approach. And secondly, the other idea that it must be, a god must be distinct from all that is, which is what she sees the absolute as. I don't think that follows necessarily. You can have pantheism, panentheism, various types of theism that might include all that is within the action or the emanation of the divine. So I don't think she makes a clear case of the difference between personal absolute idealism and theism. So it's quite conceivable that her arguments, if they're persuasive to someone, could be arguments that are compatible with theistic belief of some shade. Thanks for listening. I've tried to keep this fairly short. Hope it's been of some interest to you. Please give a like if you found it at all interesting. Please do subscribe so you can access more content, and please tune in next time. By the way, I should just mention my material for her has come from this rather splendid book called Idealism, New Essays in Metaphysics, editors Tyrone Goldschmidt and Kenneth Pearce, Oxford University Press, and this particular essay that I was drawing on was by Chris McDaniel. Got to attribute where things came from, I think. Thanks for listening. Bye.